Well, hello and welcome to Broadcasting Scotland. You're watching Scotland at 7 with me, Hugh Stewart, on Wednesday, the 10th of November. And as you've seen there, Boris Johnson has just arrived early this afternoon at Glasgow Central. Let's quickly go over tonight's headlines, then we'll look at some of those stories in more detail, and I'll introduce you to our guest. So the first story, of course, we will be looking at Prime Minister Johnson arriving at Glasgow. We're also going to look at the question of MPs taking second jobs. We will have a discussion on the EU-UK trade dispute. And then mainly we're going to talk about various aspects of the COP26 conference today, which is particularly featuring transport, taking the carbon out of transport, and also there was a draft statement of what the parties have agreed to so far. So those will come up later on. But first, just before we do the COVID numbers, can I introduce tonight's guest? We're joined tonight from Kirkliston by Peter Curran. Hello, Peter.
Hi.
Good to see you and hear you there. All our connections seem to be working well. Okay, Peter, I'm going to read out the latest COVID news from the Scottish Government. Then we'll quickly go over those news headlines, and then we're going to look into some of the COP news today in a bit more detail. So first of all, the coronavirus update. As of 2 p.m. today, a total of 3,496,268 people in Scotland have been tested at least once through the NHS Scotland labs or the UK regional testing centres. Of these, 2,825,539 have been confirmed negative, and by today, 670,729 have tested positive. There are 3,852 new cases of COVID confirmed today, which is slightly higher than the average for last week. Although not everyone with the virus will display symptoms, and not all those with symptoms will be tested. There are 19 new reported deaths today of people who have tested positive. The number of patients in Scotland who have died from complications caused by the coronavirus infection now stands at 9,332. This number only includes those who have died having received a positive test for the virus in the previous 28 days. Of the people who have tested positive, 778 were in hospital last night, 61 of whom were in intensive care. As of 8 a.m. today, 4,325,307 people have received their first dose of a COVID-19 vaccination, and 3,920,006 people have received their second dose. The latest UK daily figures today show 142,338 tested positive for COVID-19, and in total, that number have now sadly died from their illness, which is an increase of 214 since yesterday. This number refers to deaths in all settings, not just in hospitals. As it's a Wednesday, we also have the National Records of Scotland update midweek. These figures dated the 7th of November 21. 11,818 deaths have been registered in Scotland where a novel coronavirus was mentioned on a death certificate, according to the NRS, National Records of Scotland. In the week up to the 7th of November, 140 deaths were registered which mentioned COVID-19 on the death certificate, and that's an increase of 5 deaths from the previous week. 25 of those were aged under 65, 43 were from 65 to 74 years of age, and there were 72 deaths in people aged 75 or over. Out of the total of 140, 78 were male and 62 were female. Okay, now on to today's news. As we saw earlier on, Prime Minister Boris Johnson arrived in Glasgow by train. That was just 2 or 3 hours ago this afternoon. And we'll come back to that footage shortly. The Prime Minister then went on to the COP conference just a couple of miles away from the central station, and he stressed that there is still a lot of tough negotiating to do before the end of the conference. So let's have another look at that footage from Central Station earlier on this afternoon. Amber Heath from Broadcasting Scotland went down to the station, and she was there when the Prime Minister arrived. So that was a scene at Central Station today when Amber went down with the cameras to see the Prime Minister arriving. She's also had some interesting interviews with people, which we'll turn to later on. The Prime Minister didn't stop to have a chat. So on down at the conference centre, shortly after that, the Prime Minister said he was very frustrated to see that countries which have spent 6 years conspicuously patting themselves on the back for signing that promissory note in Paris are now quietly edging towards default. Now that vulnerable nations and future generations are demanding payment now in Glasgow, here now in Glasgow, the Prime Minister went on, the world is closer than it has ever been to signalling the beginning of the end of anthropogenic climate change, and its greatest gift. It's the greatest gift we can possibly bestow on our children, our grandchildren, and the generations unborn, the Prime Minister said. I'd like to cut over to Peter now, if you have any immediate reaction to that. Let me just remind you what the Prime Minister said. And among other things, anyway, he did, of course, call a press conference just a few minutes after that arrival. He said two things that we have quoted. First of all, everyone was patting themselves on the back after the Paris Agreement, Peter, but now they're quietly edging towards default. What's the Prime Minister doing there? Is he trying to force people to concentrate and make a deal? Or is he trying to say, if they don't make a deal, it's not my fault?
I think very much the latter. I mean, it's very difficult for me or for any objective observer to take Boris seriously on anything he says. I mean, he's a classic old Tony. He will come out with bland statements, and you can be sure that anything he says, the planet won't come first. Boris and Boris's survival will come first. But stating the obvious at this point in time is not really helpful. I mean, if he could only have shown some understanding and give us some insights into the process of negotiation. Of course, he hasn't been there all the time. He spent his time in other obscure engagements or holidays trying to avoid answering to the Houses of Parliament. The COP negotiations are the epitome of complex negotiation. I mean, a negotiation between two people or two parties in groups is one thing, but something like that between nations, it's like strategic arms limitations talks. It's of infinite complexity. Now, the previous COP, which Obama was substantially influential in and not in any positive way, based its negotiating strategy on something of try and achieve a deal by constructive ambiguity. This is an arcane negotiating concept that you reach a statement of what you've agreed on, which is so loose and non-specific that any party later in the day can say, well, I interpret that differently from you. Now, sensible negotiators reserve that for single, perhaps quite serious questions, but they're not the main event. And it's a way of getting them off the table in a kind of holding way to avoid breaking down the whole thing. But when you base a whole conference on it and a deal on it, you get a deal that was meaningless, which is essentially what the 2015 deal was. The present approach, from what I can gather from the rational commentators that say anything about it, is based more on reaching small, measurable deals and committing to outcomes and targets in a very specific way. And in the early part of the week, last week, they actually did some useful things on that account. But we're now in the final stage, and the final stage of negotiation is, to use a highly technical American term, shit or get off the pot time. You've really got to focus like a laser on the key issues. And it's very much about trying to marshal together key summaries and then say, this is what we have agreed. This is what we've committed to, reiterating very clearly specific targets, measures, milestones, and frankly, penalties for disagreement. I can only hope.
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
I can only hope for the planet's sake that they realize that they're really in the last chance saloon in the next couple of days, and so is the world.
Well, you were saying ambiguity might well be the diplomat's friend when it comes to complex multi-party negotiations. Obviously, we've got 200 odd countries there. How can you get them all to agree on anything? However, we are going to look at some of the individual agreements that have been reached. But I've noted your phrase constructive ambiguity. One thing that you cannot fool is you can't fool the atmosphere, you can't fool the planets. You can't tell that.
Absolutely.
Can you wait another 10 years? We've not finished talking yet. So we're going to look at some of the big issues. And let's not forget, before we move on from this topic, the president of the conference, Alok Sharma, yesterday said that we have a mountain to climb in the next 72 hours. Well, with Prime Minister Johnson's arrival today, that's now 48 hours. So we will be looking again at some of the detail of today's COP. Let's return to some more of the other political stories making the news today. Geoffrey Cox, Conservative MP for Cornwall, well, is it Cornwall? Somewhere in the southwest anyway, has been working as a lawyer abroad, while at the same time working as an MP. As a matter of fact, he's even been voting in the House of Commons while he's been in the British Virgin Islands. Now, this controversy obviously has been running for a few days now, but today Geoffrey Cox, justifying himself, said that he was cleared by the Conservative Chief Whip, who allowed him to vote by proxy while he was actually in the Caribbean doing his other job. Right. So on the debate about whether MPs should have two jobs, Sir Geoffrey Cox today, talking of his decision to spend a month in the British Virgin Islands and earning over £800,000 while he was working to defend the British tax haven against a British Foreign Office inquiry into corruption. In other words, the Conservative MP Geoffrey Cox for West Devon, he was Tories in West Devon, is employed to defend the British Virgin Islands in a corruption probe launched by the British government, which Cox's statement, which was strangely written in the third person, said, as to the use of the proxy prior to his visit to the BVI, British Virgin Islands, he consulted the Chief Whip specifically on this issue and was advised that it was appropriate. Yeah, we were looking at his words earlier on, Peter, today, because this is Geoffrey Cox talking about himself in the third person. We're not sure if that was him or somebody else talking. But anyway, whoever it was, finds it all completely above board. There's a couple of issues here, isn't there? There's a question of what do the constituents of Torridge and West Devon think of their MP spending at least a month earning a lot of money in the Virgin Islands when they thought he was representing them in Parliament. And the other thing is the case. It's the British government against a British territory, and a British MP is getting paid to take one side against the other. Is that all fine and above board in your book, Peter?
Well, there's a lot in there, Hugh. Let me go back to the beginning. The nature of the issue here has been conflated, to use a word that's been much bounced about in Parliament recently, without seeing the essential differences in the key nature of it. If we make a fundamental distinction to start with, the first question is, should an MP, especially should an MP holding a post of minister, have any form of paid outside activity? The second one is about the nature of that paid activity. Now, we may ask why people pay a king's or a queen's ransom, as the case may be, to a politician who's doing work. Now, if that politician is a highly renowned brain surgeon or a cancer surgeon, and we have an admirable example of that in one of our own MPs, who is a surgeon and has devoted, operative phrase, her free time and her holiday time to doing something that she does best, expertly, and was desperately needed by society. That's one thing. But when you're acting in your professional capacity that you had, your job, if you like, before you entered politics, some key questions arise. If you're simply saying, I'm a lawyer and I'm now lawyering, or I'm a doctor and I'm now doctoring, or I'm an accountant and I'm now doing accounts, that's one thing. And there is an argument that says the very nature of Parliament says you have to draw people from the professional classes as well as from all classes to give a reflection of society in the Parliament, and it's vital that these people have certain expertise. The other side of it says, once you've decided to run for office or be an MP, you have no other activity. You've got to suspend all your activity. So that's one side. The other side of it is, when you look hard at the nature of the employment, is you say, what is the client hiring this person for? I mean, with another example of somebody who worked 34 and a half days for a couple of clients and earned 168,000. There was no particular evidence of high, scarce expertise that this person was offering. And you have to say, the only thing that an MP has to offer is influence and access. And in this case, it was questions in Parliament. Now, Geoffrey Cox is a different thing. He's a highly regarded barrister, he could command high fees outside. The other side of course, is the self-interest one. And I have to say, all the evidence points to the fact that not all of the Tory party, but a significant part of the Tory party, and to some degree, but a much lesser scale, other parties, see holding political office or being elected as a representative as a route to enriching themselves. It's bold and as simple as that. There is, I understand it to some degree, if someone has been a high earner to the degree that an MP's salary, even with expenses, is a reduction, only a selfless public service motivation would make them accept that. If you're earning £250,000 or whatever as a high-flying barrister and you decide to become an MP and a minister, 81,000 and even whatever the ministerial addition to that is going to look pretty. But you knew the game you were getting into. If you didn't want to take the heat, you should have stayed out of the kitchen. So there's a difference between doing work that is valid work and would be valid in Civvy Street, and simply selling yourself because of access. And that should be illegal, and in my view should face draconian penalties. I think it's a threat to democracy.
Well, indeed, I was going to make the point that the two cases, the Cox case this week and the Patterson case this week, there's an odd contrast between them. First of all, when Prime Minister Johnson arrived in Glasgow today and held his press conference, I expect he was quite annoyed to find that most of the journalists actually wanted to talk about the Cox case and not about the COP26 at all. So Johnson had to defend his actions on both of these cases. Now, what strikes me as odd, Peter, I wonder if you agree, is that Prime Minister Johnson was really, I think, in political terms, very critical of Cox. I mean, he didn't come out and say he shouldn't do this, he should resign as an MP. He did say, for example, he said that MPs should be accessible, they should be visible to their constituents. It should be apparent to the constituents in North Devon that Geoffrey Cox is on their side. He's batting for them, even if he's not actually here at the moment. So he's criticised Cox, but he didn't criticise Patterson. But the odd thing is, Peter, that Patterson clearly did breach the House of Commons rules. But Cox, as you said, hasn't actually breached any rule at all. He's just doing his professional job. So it's odd that the one who has breached the rules was defended, and the one who's not actually in breach of the rules is the one who was attacked. Does that strike you as an unusual choice?
Not for Boris, it doesn't. It's exactly the kind of choice I would have expected Boris to make, because the issue and the impact on democracy and the legality or the ethical part plays no part in Boris's decision. Boris' decisions revolve around a world of Boris. It's the classic old Etonian approach. He simply judged this on, is my Boris Johnson's best interest served in supporting this guy or blaming him? And he would have no hesitation in spinning on his heels and moving from one position to the other if he thought the evidence showed that there was a threat to him. That's exactly what he did with Patterson. They hugely and monumentally misjudged him. I mean, somebody said that he's two co-conspirators in this, to use the phrase jokingly, Rees-Mogg and Andrea Leadsom, were the most inept duo since the old ladies and arsenic in old lace. It was a dreadful cock up. But Boris didn't see it because his judgment is, I was going to say his judgment is flawed. I think his judgment is absent in most cases completely. So
Absent, yeah. Yeah, people have often said he's been absent, of course, during this week as well, just coming back up by train at least today to see if we can repair some of the damage, at least at the COP26. We'll just quickly put a full stop to that story very quickly and we'll move on to the next one. But just to summarise on that point, for the SNP, Kirsten Oswald, Member of Parliament, said today, it's beyond doubt that Boris Johnson's Tory government is giving the green light to rampant Tory sleaze and corruption. The Tories are rotten to the core, out of control, and will get rid of all scrutiny in order to protect their own interests. Westminster is broken beyond the pair. Kirsten Oswald there talking really about the Patterson and taking money rather than about the Cox case, which is slightly different. But on the subject of money, we're returning to another story which we very briefly covered the other day, so I'll just quickly go over that. The Scottish National Party today called on Douglas Ross to come clean over corruption as the Scottish Tories refused to reject tainted donations and distance themselves from dark money. The SNP have said Scottish Conservatives have failed to hand back tens of thousands of pounds in donations from two firms linked to criminal activity and have refused to rule out taking more donations from such businesses in the future. The SNP allegation is that corruption from Westminster has spread to Scotland with so-called dark money donations to an anti-independence campaign group which supported pro-union parties such as the Scottish Conservative Party in the Holyrood elections earlier this year. The implication is that these dark money donations, where the identities of the original donors are kept secret, may breach electoral law. So conflating, Peter, a couple of issues there together. There was a report the other day that, in fact, two Aberdeen-based businesses had given something like £20,000 to the Conservative Party. But each of these businesses, somebody in the company was in fact charged with criminal offences, including selling drugs. So why would any political party want to take money from that kind of source?
Well, let's try not to be too moralistic about it and look at the facts of the matter. Party donations are a fact of political life. They're sought by all parties, they're welcomed by all parties, and because political parties, especially when in government, need money to do a whole variety of things. So they're part of the game. Now, it's one thing to say the person giving this money, that person or individual, is a criminal enterprise. You should never have looked at it. We actually had an example of that, much more egregious example, back with Clegg, back in the days of the coalition, Nick Clegg. The Liberal Democrats took a massive donation, I think it was something like £1.25 million, from a known fraudster, convicted of criminally extracting money from people, and that the donation money was essentially the money that he had defrauded people of. And these people and a whole chorus of voices demanded that the Liberal Democrats give it back and attempt to make restitution at one remove to these people for the money stolen from them. The Lib Dems' reply to that in the mouth of Nick Clegg still beggars belief. He said, well, we can't because we've spent it. Now, I don't think...
That's obviously the thing to do, yeah. I'm sorry, yes. I'm just going to move on, Peter. Commenting on this point for the Scottish National Party, MSP Audrey Nicholl said, there's an increasingly nasty stench emanating from the Scottish Conservatives. It is dangerous and unhealthy that those with the deepest pockets can secretly influence our democracy. This is a real test, she said, for Douglas Ross's leadership. He must come clean and accept that these donations are deeply tainted and refuse to accept any further funds from such sources. The Scottish Tories cannot claim to be any different from their Westminster colleagues if they are tainted with tainted and dark money donations. The only way we can shake this off is for Scotland to become an independent country, she said. I'm cutting a long story short there. However, I think you maybe put your finger on it there, Peter, if they've long since spent the money. I don't know if I can think of any occasion of a party handing back money, because it's not the first time this kind of issue has arisen. And you've just reminded me, mentioning Nick Clegg there. He's now got a new job, of course. He was seen maybe on people's electronic devices last week, working with Mark Zuckerberg. So, we'll just leave that there for us now. So Nick Clegg now works for Facebook. Now I'm going to move on to the next story, which is another rumbling story that really keeps coming back. It's the EU and the UK negotiation. This is the oven-ready deal, which Prime Minister Johnson signed as he became Prime Minister, and when he got Brexit done. Remember when he did that? Article 16 of the agreement that the European Union made with Britain on Northern Ireland allows Britain to walk away from that Northern Ireland Protocol if agreement can't be made. Maybe that needs to be explained. We're supposed to have made this agreement quite a while ago, but the agreement still doesn't seem to be cemented in. Anyway, for this week we hear from today's news, the UK and the EU, of course, have been debating the need for checks on goods moving from Great Britain, from the island of Great Britain to Northern Ireland. Now, these checks, if you like, the border check in the North Sea, is the alternative to having a border within the island of Ireland itself. Such a physical border could threaten peace, which was established, of course, by the Good Friday Treaty of 1998. Briefing the European Union ambassadors today, Markus Šefčovič, who's the European Commission Vice President, said talks with Britain are not going well. The Commission already offered a package of measures to smooth the flow of goods, but did not agree to the full overhaul that was demanded by the UK, who have threatened to walk away from the EU-UK trade agreement, which had been signed by Prime Minister Johnson. Vice President Šefčovič said that there was consensus among the EU member states that such a move from the UK would be unjustified and would be met by a clear European response. So it looks, Peter, that according to Maros Šefčovič, anyway, there is unanimity on the European side. They believe, in fact, they've moved a great deal. They've made it easier for goods to move, so there won't be so many border checks. But they do insist that a certain number of border checks need to be carried out. And remember, this is borders. This is the invisible border in the North Sea we're talking about. There must be no border checks between Northern Ireland and Ireland, because that would mean returning to physical borders and maybe returning to the bad old days before the peace agreement. So, Peter, in your opinion, is the European Union justified, or is Britain justified that they have a grievance?
Well, take a step back for a moment. The first thing to say is the root of this problem was that in the negotiations, the original negotiations, both the EU and Great Britain and Northern Ireland grossly underestimated the complexity of the issue they were dealing with. They simply hadn't thought it through at any level in depth. So the agreement itself threw up the problems that should have been brought out by proper analytical analysis. I mean, a critical point in negotiation sequence of events is the analysis, the pre-structural position, taking apart. A negotiation is, if you cut it to its absolute simplicities, you want somebody to do something they're not doing or stop something they are doing. And it's defined as a conflict of right or interest. You want them to do something or stop doing something because you believe you have a legal right to it, or you want to establish a new right. Unless these fundamentals are clear in their minds before they start, and they weren't. There's some excuse for the EU because of the complexities of 28, or I forget which it were, 29 countries there were at that point in time, all trying to reach a common deal on this, where there was really only Ireland, Britain and Northern Ireland. But nobody showed any understanding of it. Once Britain realised, or once the UK realised what the hell it had done, it was then between a rock and a hard place between wrecking the peace agreement and upsetting the Northern Ireland nationalists, if you like, the Northern Ireland British nationalists who were seeing their identity being eroded by this border in the Irish Sea. Since then, the EU, to my view, has shown every indication and willingness to try and find a way of making this work. Whereas the UK and initially Northern Ireland spent their time simply slanging in typical knuckle-dragging Brexit language the EU for trying to wreck the agreement. All sides have now seen some sense, but that Britain can't let go of this negative dialogue. And they've now managed to upset not only the EU, but Southern Ireland and Northern Ireland. Now, Northern Ireland politicians in general are not a bunch that I have great admiration for. There's some good people among them. But Southern Ireland has some notably effective, articulate, highly intelligent politicians. Simon Coveney is one. These are reasonable men who have a wider vision and recognise that the process is compromised. I don't know how they're going to get out of this. I'm just reading Fintan O'Toole's new magisterial book about his own country, Ireland, and everything that went right with it and everything that went wrong with it. And you realise that the island of Ireland, north and south, is still a powder keg for a whole number of reasons. I have some direct experience of it in my industrial life, but I won't go into that. So this is still a very worrying development. On balance, to answer your question, I think the right is pretty heavily on the side of the EU. And I feel sorry for the Northern Ireland politicians who they're caught between the pincer movement of the reality of Europe and Southern Ireland, the Republic of Ireland being a member of the EU, and Britain, and they're getting knocked.
Yes, it looks like Johnson, maybe Prime Minister Johnson, underestimated that complexity. He seemed to say at the start of the negotiations that the Northern Ireland trade business could really be solved by, scanning a few barcodes. But as you say, Peter, it's it's immensely complicated. One thing we know about trade negotiations is that they tend to go on for many years and that they're not at all simple. Now, that's a story we will return to for that reason. It's not going to be finished for a long time yet. So we'll see how the negotiations continue. But one thing we can make clear then, Peter, is that the oven-ready deal turns out not to have been so ready after all. So for the remainder of the programme tonight, we're going to look at some of the decisions made and some of the declarations which have been issued at COP26 today in Glasgow. Now, first of all, let's look at the General Declaration on Zero Emissions Transport. So transport is a big issue that was raised today. Now, to introduce that one, Amber also spoke to some people down at Central Station today who came up on a couple of interesting trains. Have we got that video ready now, Brian? We're moving on to zero carbon vehicles. That's what the big thing's all about. Right, here's Amber's report from Central Station right today.
So I'm Mary Grant and I'm the Chief Executive of Porterbrook, and Porterbrook is behind the design and build of Hydroflex, which we're showcasing here at COP26. It's a tri-mode, so it's an electric hydrogen battery system, which is great because it gives you a lot of flexibility and range. But from a hydrogen perspective, it's run on 4 fuel cells that are powered through green hydrogen, so that's the renewable element of it as well. And we have 36 hydrogen tanks. That has a range of about 300 miles in pure hydrogen mode. And then, of course, what we can do is complement that with the electric capability still on the system to go further. So it's about discontinuous. You might have some routes that have got some electrification. When you don't, you can switch into hydrogen. And then, of course, what we're doing is creating a complete emission-free solution for the future. And what we brought up to COP is actually the opportunity to showcase a heavy rail, hydrogen-supported electric proposition that's also been taken from a 30-year-old upcycled train. So it's a really important message about the whole circular economy, the whole green economy. We've worked with 30 SMEs in the UK, and we've also recycled, the tables in the train are made out of plastic bottles, our lighting is very efficient, even the material that's been used to wrap the train. So taking a very sustainable approach to what this this hydrogen proposition should look like. And this is about starting the conversation of what's the possibility, because of course what you need is the infrastructure with it. It's not just a train that you need that capability. And as I said, this is a train that runs on green hydrogen, so we need that capability. Our hydrogen source that we have at the moment is stored in mobile bowsers that we can then put through a high pressurised fueling system. But of course that's not the future either. But if you don't start it somewhere, it's never going to come. And that, you just have to go back and look at the advances of batteries into cars. So we think this is complementary to a core electrification, but also to battery systems, and then of course what we've created here, which is that combination of electric hydrogen capability as well.
I'm Alice Gilman, I'm Head of Marketing for Viva Rail. We're the manufacturers of this train, which is the UK's first next generation battery train, and it's there to provide emission-free travel off the wires. Most trains in the country now are either diesel or electric, and electric trains run off either the overhead wires or the third rail, both of which are fantastic, smooth ride, the way to go, because obviously it's an emission-free travel, but it's hugely expensive to put up. So if you've got on-board sources of power, such as batteries, you can carry on off the wires, as we call it, but still got that emission-free element. So each battery has 100 kilowatt hours of charge in it, and on this train there are 6 batteries. So this particular train can travel for up to 100 kilometres on its battery power alone, and then recharge in under 10 minutes. Yeah, so you can see suddenly it opens up huge swathes of the country, because you've got that it's not actually the batteries that are interesting in this technology, it is that ability to recharge so quickly. So on a longer route, you just have intermittent fast charge stations, and you've got yourself an electrified network without having to put in an OHL. To decarbonise our network, we're going to need all kinds of new technologies. Battery trains are ready to go into service today. Hydrogen trains are very much something that we need to integrate into the system. So no, we're not competitive, we're complementary to each other.
Okay, what a happy note to end on. We're not competitors, we're complements. Now, I think I'll just make one point on this, Peter. I'm not going to ask you about the merits of the various different types of propulsion system. I don't know if that's a book you read a lot. I wonder in general, what's your opinion on what you might call a technological fix? So those two spokespersons, that was Alice from Aviva Rail, with the rapid charging battery train, and we had Mary from Hydroflex, who's offering a hybrid. Really, it's either a battery or a hydrogen hybrid. So I'm not going to go into the complexities of how those work, for a very good reason that you might be able to guess. I don't know. I wonder if you think, are we going the right way? Are we saying, with the vital decisions that have to be made in COP, really, can we get our way out of it using a technological fix? What's your view? Should we just travel less and get used to less consumption, or should we just try and use science to kind of build our way out of the problem?
Well, let's go back and look at the root of this again. In the developed world, for lack of a better word, and that includes the West, and to some degree now in a different context, China, but certainly in America, the dominant mode of transport is not public transport. The dominant mode is private transport, and private transport utilizing fossil fuels. And this makes a massive, I'm not quite sure of the statistic, but it's almost primarily the main cause of the problem. And you could refer to this as the addiction to the car. Now, I often say this on the programme, make no apologies, but I'm old enough to have seen different times. I'm a dinosaur in some respects from a different era, Hugh. I remember when in a street close to the centre of Glasgow, in Denison, there were only 3 cars in my street. One of them, during the war, belonged to the local black market Spiv. The other one belonged to a newsagent, and the third one belonged to somebody who'd made his fortune in the Raj in India. When it was election time, the kids used to rush out en masse because they had a once in a 5-year opportunity to run on the running board of a car and get old ladies to the polling station. Now, since then, the car has become dominant, the one-car family, the two-car family, even the three-car family. So as well as the technological solution, there's got to be a social, psychological solution as well. We have to get people to stop using cars. We're not going to change all cars to electric overnight. I'm in favour of technical solutions. I mean, we have the science to make major technical change, and it's being done. And if it's accelerated and pressurised in one way or another and helped, more importantly, it may make a defining contribution. The electric trains, I think, are wholly positive, and I would like to see it focused on electrification of public transport, because it's a much more tall order to wean people off the right to buy a gas-guzzling, fossil fuel-consuming private car and point to two cars in the garage as a proof that they've arrived. So it's going to be a mix of solutions.
Well, I tell you what, Peter, I was very impressed by the two interviewees that Amber spoke to today because of their enthusiasm. And I thought I had to ask a question about technology, but I think you've put it right, because you could, of course, have the same kind of technology apply to, 20 million private cars, but it's a lot more efficient if you apply it to a couple of hundred trains, with a lot of people on them. So, yeah, I think you've maybe made a more important distinction there about, is it individualised transport or mass transit, and can we make the mass transit better? Of course, one of the reasons why people like individual cars is because, well, the car manufacturers spend a great deal of money making them nice environments, don't they? They're cuddly, safe. They've got everything you need at a finger press. So make mass transit better, make buses and trains appealing, and people will want to use them. We will come back to that and to the issues of hydrogen. We're going to discuss that tomorrow. We need to make the hydrogen to make these trains run. Now, Peter, I'm going to run through a couple of stories. Some of these will be quite brief and some will spend a bit longer on. Just to underline what we were saying on transport, we heard today from Mark Ruskell of the Scottish Green Party about the Scottish Government publishing the draft National Planning Framework. And this, for the first time, shifts Scotland's transport policy in a greener direction. According to Mark Ruskell, we're now investing more in our offshore wind capacity and more support for renewables. But this also means, for the first time, moving towards what he calls the 20-minute neighbourhood. In other words, the idea that wherever you are, you can get your messages, you can get what you require by foot or bike transport, not too far away. So Mark Ruskell says that for the first time, we're spending something like 10% of the transport budget on green travel, by which I guess he means bikes. So he's saying that the 20-minute neighbourhood means that towns will work for people and not generating more traffic jams. So we're beginning to see that move away from the private car culture, if you like. Now, I'm going to quickly go over another very important announcement, though, but I don't know an awful lot about it, Peter, so I'll just go quickly over green shipping. As part of the COP26 conference today, over 20 countries have signed the Clydebank Agreement to establish green shipping corridors. Now, these corridors can be between two countries or between two and more, and what they intend to do at each end is to aim for decarbonising the whole system. That's not only the ships themselves, but also all parts of infrastructure upstream, all of the deliveries and so forth. So what they're aiming to do is, on the one hand, they want to encourage, green engines. They want to move into zero emissions engines of one kind or another for the shipping, and they also want to make sure that the equipment to support that will be at the shore. So among the signatories to the deal today are Britain, Australia, Denmark, Netherlands, and America. So this is part of the long-running law of the sea set of negotiations conducted by the International Maritime Organization. So it's shipping trying to make sure it has its role to play in trying to keep 1.5 alive. Now, just before we move back to COP today, another signature today, which Scotland has also signed the 4 in 1,000 initiative. Now, this refers to agricultural soil and the ability of soil to soak up carbon. It's often overlooked, as well as looking at the carbon reserves in the oceans and in the forests, that the soil itself holds huge amounts of carbon if you look after it properly. The 4 in 1,000 initiative is about the percentage of soil, the percentage of carbon in the soil. You can look at it online if you want to know more. But this actually comes back from a COP21 conference in Paris a few years ago. And it supports techniques to improve the soil quality and to allow the soil to maintain its nutrition, and that in turn means it retains more carbon. So in fact, if you look after your soil, you can soak up a lot more soil in the soil than you can in the oceans. So that's a quick one on there. So if you want to read more on that, it's on the Scottish Government website. But that's another one of the initiatives that you were talking about earlier on, Peter. There's lots of negotiations, lots of small initiatives have been successful during COP. And now I'm turning to one more. This returns to the hydrogen policy we talked about earlier on. It's not really part of COP, but the Scottish Government today has announced that it's committing another 100 million into a green energy plan. And this is all about generating hydrogen. We saw earlier on that the one of those trains could have hydrogen as its source, but the question is, where are you going to get the hydrogen from? So the Scottish Government is committing more funding into hydrogen in the northeast and into hopefully running a fleet of hydrogen-powered buses. Okay, so is that the kind of direction we should be going in, Peter? Do you think we're going to be running a hydrogen economy in the next few years?
Well, after that long, complex statement of a variety of things, I don't think I can come back with a simple answer on that. Really asking that question, with respect to you, I know it wasn't your motivation. It's like a lot of questions on this. Where is the magic bullet? You know, there must be one single magic solution which is going to transform everything. There isn't. It's going to be a mix of technological solutions, political solutions, economic funding solutions, and significantly, a massive change in the way people perceive that the life they want to live, the life they want their children to live. I think we have a generation now, although they seem to hugely enjoy themselves doing a variety of things, are beginning to question the lifestyle that's been handed to them, the lifestyle of the continental holiday where you flew off twice a year to wherever, and the lifestyle of the massive event where you can't possibly enjoy music unless it's in a huge smoke-filled, drug-filled atmosphere with thousands of people. That may be reflecting my age here. I've always preferred the intimate gathering rather than the mass gathering. I never enjoyed going to football matches or mass events. But we really have to rethink our lifestyle. If you think about it, the lifestyle many people have in this industrial commercial society is to be complicit in the destruction of all that matters about the planet we live on and make enough money so that you can retire to a place in the country or even have a second home in the country where you can pretend you're living the simple life. These people have to realize we all have to live a simpler life, which doesn't have to be a life that loses us anything. In fact, it will give us an enormous amount more. Now, I'm as guilty as everybody else in this. I've lived a long life doing all the things, all the sins there are, at least economically and socially, are probably committed. I'm ashamed of myself. I apologize to the next generation and the one beyond it, and in my family, the fourth generation, for my part in fucking up the world that they're going to have to live in. This message really has to be got across. And all credit to Extinction Rebellion, who get some of their postures monumentally wrong, but overwhelmingly they've forced this onto a kind of agenda. And an 18-year-old girl can speak so maturely about huge issues which mature politicians of advanced age don't understand, says something, but she is still an 18-year-old. And there is an element of maturity has to come into it, as some of the demonstrations showed. And I'm not criticizing, far from Obama criticized him. They should criticize Obama. Obama is nobody's saint. compared to Donald Trump and the one that came before him, is a good. In terms of what he did in relation to this climate change, he's as guilty as the lot of them, and he should zip his lip and just accept that Extinction Rebellion at least made people like him think about what they were doing. So it's going to be a two-pronged technical people.
Yeah, well, when you talk about the well, one thing that was apparent to me, Peter, when I saw the demonstrations in Glasgow on Saturday, was the emphasis on, well, urgency. People are saying, like, it's an emergency. What do you do in an emergency? You get cracking, you get on with it, you take urgent action. Now is the time. So as you say, that's why the Extinction Rebellion people are, maybe sometimes a bit precipitate in the kind of choice of demonstrations that they make. But there's no doubt about it. We haven't got time to waste. It's the time is now. Who is it? At the start of COP said, now's the time and now's the hour. But I'm going to, however, just flip back to our discussion on cars earlier on. We were discussing, Peter, whether the individual personal transport really has to go or whether we're best to use mass transport. But, one of the other decisions made today was called the Glasgow Declaration on Zero Emissions Transport, and it's really back to cars again. So let's see what has been agreed. Some countries and some states within countries have promised a move towards zero emission transport. This is basically cars and vans. The big car companies who have signed up include Ford and General Motors and Volvo and Daimler and Land Rover Tata and the BYD group from China. Also, some countries and the state of California and the state of New York, as well as Britain and the EU, have signed up. So what they're all saying is that we will still have private cars after 2035, but they will not be using gasoline or diesel. As well as the car makers, major car users or van users like Sainsbury's and Uber and LeasePlan, who purchased 1.7 million vehicles over 30 countries, have agreed to take part in this zero emissions car program by the year 2035. However, the bad news is that some important players have not taken part, and that includes Germany, China, and America, apart from the states mentioned above. Also, Toyota and Volkswagen are not in it. So 2 reasons behind the reluctance on behalf of certain players are, on the one hand, the uncertainty about the rollout at government level of suitable infrastructure, notably charging points for electric vehicles. And also the Germans point out to the lack of clarity about whether you can use combustion fuels which were derived from plants. So there's discussions still to be had on that. Can you grow petrol in a field, and what does that do about land use and food prices? Data from the International Energy Agency shows that about 1/4 of all carbon emissions come from cars, trucks, ships, buses, or planes. So a quick comment on that, Peter. So that's really back to the car again. Is the car okay as long as it runs on something green?
Well,
I'm wondering. I said earlier on, it's obviously easier to make a train green than to make 100 cars green. Yeah. And also, I wonder if we can actually have enough charging points.
I mean, quite frankly, I was asked that question by somebody. The kind of mind.
I'm afraid sound isn't very. Excuse me, Peter. I'll come back to you in a couple of minutes. The sound is a bit. Your sound is cracking up there. I hope you can hear me, but we're not really getting a clear audio from you.
It's typically Scottish. It'll never work. Cast around for something that. Yeah, I don't think. They said the same about petrol. Almost every change, we will not have enough to support it. That's bollocks, in the wider sense of saying it. But I remember I worked for Goodyear, a huge American multinational company, for 14 years, obviously committed to the car industry because they produced tires, but they also saw themselves as rubber manufacturers, and they maintained a Zeppelin blimp for years, and they still do, the Goodyear blimp. It's no accident, it's that they believed that the tragedy of the Zeppelin landing printed in the public consciousness, the air transport that was not fossil fuel dependent in any significant sense, and was cleaner than anything else on mass scale. It's a case, believe it or not, for airship transport. I'm just citing an example of what, at the time, Britain and every other trading nation was great. We did it by the clean mode of transport, sailing ships. We took nothing from everything back there, and we became hugely and dominant through the globe. Imagination apply to these things. We have to get beyond the mundane.
I think so, yes. I think that's right, Peter. I'm sorry, the sound wasn't very good there. I hope that people got most of what you were saying, Peter. So we've covered a lot of the stories, the individual declarations and some of the individual negotiations that took place at COP26. So we have 2 days to go. We are hoping to get the deadline on time Friday. The Prime Minister said today it may go to extra time, but he hopes not. And again, Alok Sharma underlined earlier on that he hopes that it is all actually going to be finished by the deadline Friday. We wouldn't be surprised, however, if the individual negotiations drag on, because that's usually is what tends to happen in complex international negotiations. So we haven't any more time just now, but we will be coming back to some of the issues that have been raised, in particular energy and Scotland's role in the hydrogen industry. And we're going to discuss that tomorrow, hopefully, if we can get that show together. So let me finally just thank everyone who's put the show together tonight. Thank you to you, Peter Curran, for joining us. It was a pleasure to talk to you and go over some of these points. Some of the kind of philosophical and lifestyle choices that we will have to make as we move towards net zero. And also like to thank the people in thank Brian and Linda in our control room. And I'd like to thank Amber Heath for getting those videos from down in the central station today. So just one final thing, which is to thank you for watching. And if you are a regular viewer to Broadcasting Scotland, then you're probably also a subscriber and one of our supporters. And if you are, we're very grateful for your support. Of course, you can't run a programme like this without support. If you haven't heard us say it before, let me remind you that we receive no public funding. The only funding that we have in Broadcasting Scotland is from yourselves, it's from our supporters. So the link is on the screen just now. If you would like to donate or become one of our supporters, please do follow that link on the screen. And also, if you are already a supporter, then why don't you share this on your social media? Go on YouTube, click share, and give a share to the messages we put out. Because if you want to have independent Scottish media for Scotland, made in Scotland, then give us a hand. The more resources we get, the more programmes we will make. Okay, so that's it for tonight. So I'm Hugh Stewart, and I'll be back tomorrow. See you later. Good night.